Aw, come on, Pete. Don't tell me you're afraid of camping in the woods. I told you, I found a place. But I was afraid. I was very afraid. And I couldn't explain why, but my guts were telling me not to go there. That something terrible would be happening. Of course, I couldn't just tell my friends that, or I would have never heard the end of it before the end of the school year. You see, when you're 16 years old and your friends are calling you a pussy, all you can do is laugh it off and bury your gut feeling. I should have trusted my instincts more, but then again, I've always been the most cautious of our group. While the four of us were a force to be reckoned with at school for our jackass-worthy stuff, I wasn't the reckless one. No. I was pretty tame, all things considered. And sure, I did my lot of stupid things for attention, but I've never jumped from a 4-story building and into a pool to prove myself. But Dylan did, and he also fractured his ankle on the edge of the pool. So he spent the rest of the last summer showing it off at parties so girls could leave their numbers on his plaster. So, of course, when Dylan offered to go camping in the woods, I had my reserves. He told us he found an old hunter's cabin, that we wouldn't even need our tent because there were beds and stuff. We even had a perfect plan so our parents wouldn't figure out where we were. And we were supposed to be at Matt's place for the weekend. Matt's older brother was the one taking care of him since their parents died in a crash. And, well, he was actually pretty chill. If our parents called, he said we were going to make up some excuse for us being unable to go to the phone. And the classic shower or they went to the cinema and I'll pick them up at 10 kind of deal. We were safe, and we'd done that plenty of times already and it always worked out. Michael put his hand on my shoulder, which forced me to come to a stop. His fox-like grin clashed with the rest of his angelic face. If I didn't know him, I would think something was very off with him, but that's just the kind of vibe he gives off. A mess of dirty blonde hair crowned him, and soft silky blue irises locked onto me. If you're scared, you could always drink this. And out of nowhere, he passed me the smallest bottle of vodka I'd ever seen. I stared at him dumbfounded, wondering where the heck he got that, and then remembered that his sister was a flight assistant. She probably stole those at work, and he found her stash. He tossed a small bottle of Jack Daniels at Dylan, and Captain Morgan bottle at Matt. Branches cracked underneath my feet as I walked closer to the rest of the group for a collective cheer with our 2-ounce bottles in hand. And after that, I did feel a lot less tense. We then kept walking, following Dylan's lead to the famous cabin in the woods he told us about. And when we got there, we all burst into laughter. This nightmarish vision was far from a hunter's cabin. It looked more like a shack that's been left to abandon for years. Wow, what a fucking 5-star luxury room you found us there, Dylan. Michael laughed even louder as he slammed his fist into Dylan's shoulder, and Dylan kept smiling like an idiot before he finally defended his point and told us it was better than a tent. We all agreed to that. Even if it didn't look clean and all that solid, there was a roof and, well, if it rained, I definitely preferred to be under there than in a tent. We finally entered the shack and the stench of mold and something else assaulted our noses. The place was gross, and I was pretty sure by the end of the weekend, that smell would be stuck to my skin and hair forever. Still, it was somewhat okay. Better than that. It looked a lot bigger than from what we've seen on the outside. I even thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Dylan smiled. Isn't this cool? You guys didn't expect it, did you? No, we certainly didn't. I'm not extra at math, but I'd say the inside of this place looks at least 3 times the size of the shack we saw on the outside. And just for good measure, I went out again to stare at the shack and then back in. It was like we opened a portal to another dimension. It just wasn't possible. However, the inside was just as run down as the outside. Everything was covered in dirt and dust, and there was even rust on the walls. I didn't even think it was possible for a wall to rust, but apparently it does. Or maybe it's old blood. The color seemed a bit too orange to be blood, but what did I know about blood, really? I never even paid attention in anatomy class, let alone listen in my biology classes. Anyway, once we were all in, we started walking toward the back, hoping to find the rooms quickly. Oh shit! The breaking noise that followed us had us all spinning around to see that Matt's legs had passed through the floor, and he was clinging to the edge stupidly. And within a minute, we were on him, lifting him up. After making sure he wasn't hurt, we teased him about his tire, and he told us to shut the fuck up. Matt was a little rounder than the lot of us, but he told us it was because of his medicine. Matt's epileptic, and while we didn't believe in the correlation of his belly and his medicine when he told us to shut up, we did laugh quite a bit harder. Once the moment passed, we decided to stay close and stalked down the corridor to find the rooms. Most of the doors were locked, and we could probably break through them easily, but we decided against it when we finally found one large enough for all of us to put our sleeping bags on the floor. The smell of dust was still strong in the air, but at least that metallic, rusted scent from earlier wasn't as strong here. Dylan got a camera out of his backpack and told us he wanted to film something for YouTube here. Maybe they could pretend this place was haunted and stuff. He turned the camera on and presented himself, then us, and made a pretty professional presentation of the place. We all knew about Dylan's YouTube channel, but it's not like he was popular. He had maybe 60 followers, and that's because of the video of him breaking his ankle. And probably 40 of the followers were from our school, but, well, we'll let him do his thing. A loud crash coming from where we entered shook the entire shack, and I don't know if I could still call this a shack though, considering the inside was probably as big as any chalet I'd ever been to. There was a large kitchen and dining area, a living room, and at least 4 to 6 doors in the corridor, which suggested at least a bathroom and 3 rooms. And as we dashed down the corridor, we quickly realized that the front porch had casually decided to detach itself from the rest of the shack, which had forced the structure to lean forward and debris from the broken ceiling to fall in front of the door. Considering the size of the beams, it'd probably take us hours to move them out of the way until we would be able to get out. Now us freaking out was probably good for Dylan's recording, and he added intensely that the ghosts didn't want us to leave. A shiver rushed down my body as his eyes shone, and I suddenly felt uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. I'd never known myself to be claustrophobic, and this place was still relatively large, but the fact that our exit was blocked deeply unsettled me. Reaching for the closet window, I realized quickly that these couldn't be open. They were just glass panels. I could probably break one with a chair, but I wasn't panicky enough right now. Hey, let's check the other rooms. Dylan pointed the camera at me and I shoved my hand at it. He told me I was pale as a ghost and just needed to chill. Stalking down the corridor again, we reached to the first locked door. Dylan passed the camera to Matt before saying a little, "Check this out," and attempting a Hollywood-worthy stunt of breaking through the door with just a kick. When he fell back on his ass, he was quick to tell us this would be cut from the video. We still got a good laugh at him, though. Taking back his camera, he told Matt to break the door. And considering he was the biggest of us, it didn't take him long for him to break it. 2 or 3 well-aimed shoulder slams, and we were in. Now, as we entered, we realized this isn't a bathroom. It's a door that leads to a basement. We didn't even know there was a basement. Using our phones as flashlights, we slowly descended into the darkness, hands scrambling about the walls, trying to find a light switch. All things considered, it was pretty stupid. We were in the middle of nowhere. There probably wasn't any electricity here. But then, the lights went on, and we were all very surprised. Unfortunately, even with the lights on, Dylan's camera still knocked something from the nearest surface, and the sound of shattering glass was the next thing we heard. The basement was certainly not anything shabby. Everything was in stainless steel and looked pretty clean, as if someone had just been there minutes ago. The mystery of the lights was resolved when we found a movement detector, but that still didn't explain why there was such a high-tech room in the abandoned shack. Dylan kicked something toward me, and I felt my heart rise in my throat. The glass jar that had exploded on the ground was full of blood-red worms in a preserved liquid. And there was maybe 4 or 5 thick, weird-looking worms in there. Now, they all looked dead, though some of them were twitching slightly. It was probably nothing, though. No signs of life in those disgusting worms. And the stench was awful, too. And now that I had one close to me, I realized how putrid it really was. It smelled like nothing I ever smelt before. Like rot and metal. I really didn't want to think about it. But it's the kind of smell I would easily associate with the decomposition of human flesh. And I don't know why I thought zombies when I smelt it. Dylan flashed his camera at the worms and kept filming the strange high-tech lab before Matt said he was bored and wanted to see the rest of the rooms. We all agreed to leave the basement, but we also knew we'd stumble upon something we probably shouldn't have. Breaking the other doors was simple enough, but we were disappointed to find out that behind them was nothing like what we found in the basement. Just a bathroom, a sort of library, and another room with foam mattresses. We got back to our room of choice, and Michael opened his backpack, only to reveal a lot more of those tiny bottles. Matt was responsible for the food, so he brought us pizza wrapped in plastic wrap, and a few cans of Dr. Pepper. Cold pizza isn't the best, but when you mix it with shots and Dr. Pepper, well, it's actually pretty okay for a meal. Before we knew it, we were all drunk and having fun, completely forgetting about the can of worms we opened in the basement. And even less longer after that, we were all making our beds. I was lucky enough to win the actual bed, so I laid out my sleeping bag on top of the foam mattress and prepared for sleep as my less likely friends prepared theirs on the floor around the room. Matt was the first one to fall asleep, his snoring loud enough to keep us awake another 20 minutes, just long enough so that we could laugh at him and throw stuff in his general direction. However, once Matt was asleep, there was no waking him up. He was the first out, but he'd also be the last up, as usual. Eventually, though, we all fell asleep. Here's where it gets a little crazy. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling thirsty as hell. I noticed a movement near Matt, but since it was dark, I couldn't see well. It's only when he rolled around and laid on his back that I saw clearly. There was a worm there, red as we saw it in the basement, crawling on the side of his neck and toward his ear. I stared at it in disgust but couldn't find myself to react. I saw it as it penetrated my friend's ear and buried its way inside, but I was convinced I was dreaming, so I just went back to sleep. I fell asleep within seconds despite being quite shaken from the sight I just witnessed. I was sure it was just a nightmare. When we woke up, Matt was gone. It wasn't in his habits to be the first to wake up, so we all decided to go look for him. We didn't find him anywhere on the first floor, so we went back down to the basement, and there he was. His face was pale, which was unusual since he was always red in the cheeks. His eyes looked darker too, and the dark circles digging under his eyes were telltales of his lack of sleep that night. And sweat had his curly brown hair stuck to his forehead, and when we finally managed to tear our gaze away from his grayish face, it was only to notice that he was holding 2 of these worms in his hands. His soulless gaze peered at us emotionally as he parted his lips and brought a worm up to his mouth. It crawled into his mouth, and I couldn't hold back. I instinctively put my hand in front of my mouth, but it was too late. The alcohol and cold pizza were making their way back up, no matter what I did. Now, Dylan and Michael were rooted on their spot, completely frozen, unable to say anything. And Matt brought the second worm to his lips, and Dylan finally reacted. He dashed towards Matt and slapped his hands, making the worm fall down to the ground. I don't know if he knew what the hell was going on, but he stomped down on the worm, which emitted a loud, shrill noise as it was crushed under Dylan's foot. Dylan screamed at Matt, asking him what the hell is wrong with him, but he didn't receive an answer. Matt's eyes started to bleed and were fixed on Dylan, and he reached for Dylan's throat and he started to squeeze. Michael and I both tried to pry his hands away from Dylan's neck, but he was too strong, too stiff, and his grip was unrelenting. I picked up a glass shard from the ground, and I stabbed Matt in the shoulder, but he didn't even budge. Dylan was purple in the face, and drool dribbled down his chin. I saw him as he passed out, and his life escaped him. Matt didn't even move, didn't even stare at me or Michael. It's Michael who put his hand on my shoulders and screamed that we needed to get the hell out of there right now. Now my fingers were covered in Matt's blood, and I was in shock as Michael dragged me out of the basement and we climbed the stairs, 2 stairs at a time. We had barely reached the floor when we heard a sickening crack and a squelching noise. We refused to think about what it was, but we were pretty sure that Dylan's head suffered the same fate as the worm he'd crushed moments earlier. And then we heard stomping. Loud, rapid stomping towards the stairs. Michael and I locked the door as we went up, and we dashed toward the entrance, but we quickly realized it was blocked. Using the chairs we found, we slammed them against the windows. It took 2 or 3 tries, and on the 3rd, it finally exploded. The glass shattering noise in unison with the wooden door bursting open as Matt finally broke through. We didn't bother looking behind us as we threw ourselves out the windows and dashed into the woods towards the road. We knew we only had a 5-minute walk to get to the road, and we could probably make it in 2. We yelled at each other just to start running, and we ran for our lives, but Matt was on our tail. I outran Michael, and I heard Michael scream behind me, but the sound came to an abrupt halt. I couldn't look back. I didn't have time for that. My heart was in my throat, and the thumping of my heart was deafening all the sounds behind me. I didn't know if Matt was still with Michael, or if he was dashing after me. All I knew is that I needed to get out of there, and I needed to get out now. When I reached the road, I didn't stop running, and I also didn't look left or right. My entire left side burned, and blood rose in my mouth as I was hit by a car, and I passed out right then and there. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room and I couldn't feel my legs. My mom was crying and my dad's face looked like he'd gotten 20 years older. And later that day, I learned that they found Michael's mutilated body in the woods. His limbs had been separated from his body, and they told me they also found the shack, but it had been burnt down to the ground, and there wasn't anything resembling an underground lab. They asked me if I took drugs, and I said that I drank alcohol, but not enough to hallucinate blood-red worms, a high-tech lab, and everything else. And oh yeah, they also found Matt in the woods, about 5 miles away from where we were. The blood under his nails and feet confirmed that they were Michael's and Dylan's. But the strangest of all was the lack of brain and spinal fluid. They said it was like someone had surgically removed his brain and cleaned the skull, without actually having to cut his skin. And oh yeah, they never did find the blood-red worms.